of the week. Perfect. So as it's recording, you don't need to turn off your mics or turn off your cameras or anything. You'll only be able to see the panelists and the people who are talking. So anyone who has just arrived, thank you very much again for attending, and welcome to the webinar. So as you all know, COP26 is taking place in Glasgow in November this year. And as you've all registered for this webinar, I'm sure you want to have a bit more of an idea of what this actually means. So hopefully at the end of this webinar, you'll go away with a better idea of what actually happens at these summits, why they're important, and then how we can actually get involved with them. So we're very lucky to have two amazing speakers on the webinar today to kind of guide us through this process. So the first speaker is Father Sean McDonagh. Sean is a Columban priest and ecologist. He's one of the foremost Catholic proponents of ecological awareness, not just in Ireland, but globally. And he is the author of several books, including Laudato Si, an Irish Experience. He also was involved in the research before the publication, which led to the publication of Laudato Si. He's a COP veteran, so he's been to several COPs, so we're very lucky to have his insight at this webinar. We also have the second speaker is Jerry McEvely. He's the head of policy in Friends of the Earth Ireland. He's over a decade experience in climate policy at national, EU and UN level. So Friends of the Earth is actually celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and it's a key NGO in the environmental movement in Ireland, and it's a founding member of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, which JCFJ is a member of. So without further ado, I will invite Sean to speak. So he's going to give a background to both COP15, the Biodiversity Summit, and COP26, which is the climate one in November. So thanks a million, Sean, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to this discussion here tonight. I'm going to speak to those two COPs, Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the United Nations Framework Convention on Biodiversity. I will talk about a few books, The Death of Life, the Chalice of Extinction, which is on the destruction of life on Earth. I published this in 2004 because I thought it was one of the most extraordinary issues that was taking place on our planet, and we were paying very, very little attention to it. The reality is that we are now living in the 6th largest extinction of life since life began. Now, there were 5 before us. The last one happened 65 million years ago when an asteroid hit an area of modern day Mexico and did so much damage to the planet that it wiped out almost half the species that were living on the planet at the time, particularly the dinosaurs. So it's an extraordinary event. So the one that's happening now in the last 70 years is even worse than that. So scientists are telling us at this time that within this century, we might lose 1 million species. That's an extraordinary level. And we can see it around us. For example, in the last five or 6 years, we now realize that we have wiped out about 40% of the insects of our planet, which are absolutely essential for pollination into the future. So one of the things we feel with the reality development of modern technologies, that's going to sort of be with us, protect us from the destruction of biodiversity, but nothing will protect us from the destruction of biodiversity, because the reality of extinction is once something is gone, it's gone forever. As I say, life began on the planet 3.8 billion years ago. We don't know how many species are on the planet with us. We have some details of about 1.7 million species. But if we lose 1 million species in these decades, what are our great grandchildren and to do into the future if we've done so much destruction to the natural world itself. So we need to give a lot more time. And it's interesting that the COP, which will take in Kunming in China, will take place in October this year, 2 weeks from now, just 2 days, and then will take place in May as well. But I'd hope by that stage we will have much more focus on biodiversity and its importance. Now, one of the issues, of course, that's very real is that the destruction of biodiversity and climate change often act together. And that's very true in Ireland, for example. We're very unusual that 34% of our greenhouse gases come from agriculture, mainly methane. But that also means we do that so that our dairy herd has developed 3 times in the last 40 years. Since 2010, we doubled the output of our dairy heads, and we're now going to double it again. But how will we be able to reduce our greenhouse gases if we continue to up our methane? And of course, going with that is the way we do agriculture into the future, the way we use pesticides, the way we use insecticides, even the very names of them. Pesticide, so they're pests. The reality is there's no pests on the planet. We're all a part of this extraordinary planet, and everything has a place. And one of the things that I would like to say as a theologian is the churches have been horrible in the way they have looked at biodiversity. And I give the example of the second most important prayer in the Catholic world for the last 1,000 years was the Rosary. And it's a prayer that many people still say every day. And yet when you come to the Salve Regina, we end up that by saying, Gementes e flentes, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. So we have no sense of the extraordinary beauty of this planet and the way it has developed life over those 3.8 billion years. And we just think of it as mourning and weeping in a valley of tears. So we have no sense that this is God's creation and that every species has intrinsic value. And one of the most extraordinary things that happened with Laudato Si, because I was involved in the preparations for it. I remember the August before it was brought out, they had begun to decide they would say nothing on biodiversity. And I wrote a very strong letter to Carter Turkson at the time. And I said, if the Pope brings out an encyclical on ecology, and he doesn't mention biodiversity, people will just laugh at him. They won't even engage him. Why should you, if you have no understanding about the importance of biodiversity? Now, the reality is, in Laudato Si, that every species is of intrinsic value. So we have to bring this very much into our prayer life. I would like to see concern for biodiversity ending up in our Eucharistic prayers every Sunday, and then in actions that will follow on from that. So that to me that will be taking place in October and in May of next year. The biodiversity of the COP26 is on climate change. Now, the reality is these conference of the parties go right back to 1992. When we had this Earth Summit that took place in actually Rio de Janeiro, and I was actually lucky enough to be there at the time. So they were looking at what was happening to our planet and what was happening, for example, in the area of climate change. Before the Industrial Revolution, there were 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Our atmosphere is composed of nitrogen, almost 79% of nitrogen, and 21% of oxygen. But neither of these gases retain heat, but carbon dioxide does. And that's the issue, and that's the problem. So until then, there was 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. It's now 416 and going up by 5 to 10 each year. And that's the real issue. if we continue to do that, for example, in this century alone, we might be increasing our greenhouse gas or our global average temperature by 3 or 4 degrees Celsius. Now, we have seen what has happened in this year globally. For example, the fires that took place in Australia, the fires that took place in California, in Siberia, in Greece and Turkey. So all over the world. And we're now only 1.1 degrees Celsius above what we were in pre-industrial levels. But if we're going to head for 2 or 3, we will be in real trouble. So we saw the wildflowers. We also saw in various areas of the world, from New York to Germany and Holland, weather situations that are very clearly linked to climate change and doing enormous damage to the environment around them. We're also could have a problem with the with the Gulf Stream. Research has pointed out that it is at its lowest level for 1,600 years. So, for example, if the Gulf Stream stopped bringing waters from the Caribbean up to Western Europe, our winters would be much colder than they are at the moment. And so this is something we must be very, very serious about at this particular time. And it's something that we need to take hugely seriously. Now, there's a problem, of course, in this time because of COVID, of having people come to Glasgow. There was about 2 weeks ago, 1,500 green groups and social justice groups called that the UN conference COP26 would be postponed until next year because many people won't have vaccines. And the British government has said that they will give them vaccines and allow them a time there before it happens. But does that mean that we're going to hear only the voice of rich people? And that would be very serious, because in this area, one of the most extraordinary things in this area is the social justice dimension. It's we in the West, you know, the Industrial Revolution started in Britain in the 1750s, moved across the Atlantic and then across Europe, then to other parts of the world. So we have benefited from this hugely in the last 200 years, but then other people haven't benefited at all. And for example, if you had a rise of 2 meters in the oceans, many islands in the Pacific would actually disappear. So these are very serious issues that we must take really seriously at this time. What's necessary at the moment is we make every single effort to reduce our greenhouse gases as much as possible. That means there's little future for coal, for oil, or gas. Now, very few people are willing to make those commitments. Very often we talk about having decisions made in other parts of the world. For example, I'm a member of Antashka. We have taken a position against the building of a cheese factory down in Kilkenny. Now, it's been built by an Irish company and a Dutch company. In Holland, they have reduced their herd by 1 million in the last 10 years. So they're asking, could we come to Ireland and we will be using about 1/10 of our capacity produced milk for this one plant alone. The Taoiseach criticized Antashka for doing that, and then yet he's over in the United Nations last week, telling us how important it is that we actually reduce our greenhouse gases. We haven't yet begun to do it with agriculture, and I can understand why, because farmers were told that this was a way to make a living. They invested huge money in the equipment available, and now is there a future for them? We also know, for example, that the data centers around the country are huge, and within 2030, maybe 50% of our electricity will be going to data centers. And there's also a group down in Kerry who would like to bring fracked gas across the Atlantic and have it down there. So we can't be doing all these things and at the same time saying we're interested in climate change. We're interested in climate change when we begin to cut our greenhouse gases use different forms of energy into the future. So Britain is leading this COP26 in Glasgow. They say they're very interested, but then a lot of people point out, well, maybe they're not so interested. For example, in the last two budgets, they have reduced their foreign aid from 0.7 to 0.5. And in this budget, they have reduced, the Foreign Office has relieved that they will cut their budget to foreign aid by 40% next year. So the budgets to East Africa will go down significantly, even though that's an area where there's a famine taking place in Yemen. So people hear rich countries saying they're willing to do things, but in actual fact, they're doing the very opposite. And they're not making available, monies for poorer countries to actually themselves work on this area of both biodiversity and climate change. The International Energy Agency has said that you can't be talking about opening up new coal mines or actually gas. And the British government, for example, are interested in opening a new coal mine in Cumbria, and also would like to see areas, particularly west of the Shetland Islands, the Cambo field. They would like to do research there in the next few years. So we can't be continuing to use fossil fuel and at the same time talking about reducing greenhouse gases. So going to Glasgow for COP26, I'd be hopeful, but actually not very hopeful at the moment. We'll need much deeper cuts in greenhouse gases if we were to keep to what was agreed in Paris in 2015, that we shouldn't allow our average temperature to go 1.1 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. As it is, we will reach that point in 5 or 6 years. So we will need very serious levels of commitment now. One final point that I think we as Catholics haven't taken seriously in the past is the reality of our population. We now have about 7.5 billion people on the planet. Within 25 to 30 years, we could have 9 to 10 billion people on the planet. I don't think we've taken seriously anything to do with population in terms of things like climate change and destruction of biodiversity. And I think it'd be good if we did such a things. So in a way, these are the most important issues facing our planet, because if we get it wrong, it will be wrong for generations and centuries after us. So we must be very serious about this, and we must educate ourselves, because we're going to have to look at transforming our energy system, transforming how we live in our houses, we're not using greenhouse gases to heat our homes, and transforming our industry. That's going to take a huge amount of effort. And have we the energy, and have we the ability to actually do that, not just in Ireland, but do it globally as well. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks a million, Sean, for your for your excellent presentation. And I think highlighting the link between climate and biodiversity, and how they're both, a lot of the causes are similar, but it also means that a lot of the solutions can act on both crises at the same time. And I completely agree that having that, I suppose, looking at the appreciation of the beauty and fostering a wonder in creation and in the environment can kind of help with that. So I'll just give a reminder to everyone that they can put their questions into the Q&A, and anything that they want to share with any other attendees, they can put in the chat box. So thanks a million again, Sean, and we'll go to the questions after Jerry. So now.
Hi there. Will I
Hi.
kick off, will I?
Yeah. Jerry, thanks very much. So Jerry's going to give a background. Jerry's going to talk about the importance of this COP in particular and how we can actually get involved. So the floor is yours, Jerry. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's great to be here, and it's great to see so many people willing to give up their, what day are we today? Tuesday evening, to learn about climate change, climate action, and the COP. So I have been asked to explain why is the COP important and how can people get involved in the Irish climate movement. So I have some written notes here. So to kick off, as Sean has explained, the COP, or the Council of the Parties, is this meeting of all state parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's essentially where all state representatives come together to reach agreement on common rules for reducing emissions and adapting to climate impacts. And it usually meets once a year, but the 2020 meeting was delayed due to COVID. The challenge is that there are at any one time scores of interlinked negotiations happening during these COP meetings. And some of these are really technical in terms of reporting on emissions, and others are usually sensitive in terms of who should be required to do what and when. So for better or for worse, some would say, the COP is the main international level event for taking collective climate action. And you might say, but hasn't all this been ironed out by the Paris Agreement, which was agreed at COP21 in 2015? So yes and no. The core objective of the Paris Agreement was to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And to achieve this, states agreed a new long-term goal where countries would aim to make sure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible and to achieve what's called climate neutrality by mid-century. What in good God's name does that all mean? So translating that jargon, that means that states have agreed to prevent catastrophic levels of global warming by cutting emissions to net zero. So the net being quite important there, net zero by 2050. The Paris Agreement said an awful lot more on how states have to take action, report on action, fund action, hold each other accountable. And some of these follow-on actions and procedures haven't been ironed out. And I won't go into all the technical detail, partly because I'm not familiar with all of it myself, but some of the things that still have to be ironed out include rules of a new global carbon market, how to avoid double counting on emissions, new transparency rules for reporting on emissions, the role of old carbon credits, and also on adaptation funding. But probably the most important issue for this COP is that every country has to come to the table and contribute its fair share of emissions reductions. And they need to do this by setting out targets, or setting out pledges, I should say, for reducing emissions, and to increase these every 5 years. This is a sort of a bottom up where states come to the table with their pledges every 5 years. This is under the Paris Agreement. But there are really important climate justice questions here. So justice, as Sean has explained, meaning those most responsible for the climate crisis need to do their fair share, and justice meaning supporting those countries who have done the least to cause the climate crisis. And the reason I say this is because the pledges submitted so far would lead to a global temperature rise of 2.7 degrees. So in other words, it's grossly insufficient what's been pledged so far. So COP26 is a moment to set more ambitious and equitable climate action. The situation is complicated because some countries, including the EU collectively, have already submitted updated pledges. Others haven't. Others are not sufficient. Others need to be increased to align with that long-term goal in the Paris Agreement, including the EU. And the other big justice issue is on financing climate action. And states need to stand by a Paris Agreement commitment to provide $100 billion per year for what's called climate finance through to 2025. And this is essentially funding to make sure less developed countries can deliver the types of climate projects, investments, infrastructure to reduce emissions and develop sustainably in a way that developed nations haven't. And this funding needs to support adaptation in these developing countries, adapt to the impacts of the climate crisis. And 100 billion may seem like a lot, but broken down across all developed states, it is achievable. And at the last count, they were 20 billion short. So we need more for adaptation funding with proper transparency, and that money must be new and additional. So states there's a tendency to sort of repackage previous commitments and to say that money over there that we pledged is actually, we'll call that climate action. So there's devil in the detail. And importantly, Ireland's climate finance contributions are below our fair share. And Concern Worldwide has good information on what developed countries need to be doing to honour their climate finance commitments. They have a web page on this, and Trócaire and Christian Aid also did an excellent report on the need for Ireland to increase its climate finance. I think it was probably 2 years ago at this stage. And a further important issue before I sort of move off this section of the conversation, as Sean has mentioned, the organisers are planning for around 20,000 people to attend, but there's inequalities of the vaccine rollout between the richer and poor have really raised serious concerns about participation among developing countries. And obviously, from a climate justice perspective, those hit the hardest must be represented and be able to attend the negotiations. But it's likely for this to be even more imbalanced due to the COVID restrictions. And that's why last month, Friends of the Earth and others supported calls to postpone the COP until it's safe for people from all countries to participate. And we also really want to see youth and Indigenous groups supported to attend. Now, it obviously hasn't been postponed, but we're still going to raise this inequity, and it's also linked to vaccine inequity. And another key issue in the COP in terms of action at national and local level, in terms of climate action, I should say, at national local level, is that we need to really put women at the centre of decision making. I mean, this is not only from the perspective that they face the greatest burdens in terms of the impacts of climate change, but they're also the most excluded from decision making. And it's been shown that empowering women at any and all levels leads to better climate outcomes. That's true not only, in terms of negotiating teams, governments negotiating teams at the COP, but also, what happens in your community. So to move on slightly, you'll see a lot of talk about commitments from governments, be that on coal or fossil fuel subsidies or electric vehicles, a lot of sort of related commitments. And Friends of the Earth here in Ireland will definitely be calling for Ireland to do its fair share in accordance with the 1.5 degrees and respecting the principle of climate justice and a just transition. And for Ireland to deliver on its climate finance commitments. We'll also be calling for Ireland to work with other states to end exploration for offshore oil and gas. And we also really want, and this is where it links back in with the Irish situation, for Ireland to respect its targets and legal obligations under a new climate act that was agreed in July. And I won't go into all that detail, which Ciara and Kevin and Sean all know too well at this stage. But the government will come forward with a new climate action plan where during the COP, where, well, highly likely it'll be during the COP, where the government will, address, set out the measures it intends to take for the next year across energy, transport, and agriculture. And there are a lot of positives there, but we have, as also as Shona said, we've been a real laggard, and there's a real need for government to focus on implementation. In other words, just setting targets and plans isn't enough. And this all needs to be done with the justice lens. So, for example, climate action, it must focus on the needs, on meeting the basic needs of the most vulnerable and improving their quality of life. So, for example, prioritizing funding for retrofitting and ensuring that those most vulnerable to fuel poverty have the best electric heating systems is a real need for a climate justice lens. So I've explained what the COP is, and it's obviously important from a government perspective. But just to insert a break here, you might ask, what do I care as a campaigner, or even just as a person generally interested in climate? Sure, those government's going to go over there, and that's their problem. And the short answer to that sort of flippant question is that the COP meetings have become the key international moment or event for mobilizing political and media attention on climate change. In other words, even if we weren't too concerned with what happens inside the negotiating rooms, we care, because this is an opportunity to highlight the importance of climate action and climate justice to the public, to push our politicians, highlight the and push not only politicians, but also decision makers, and to have these types of conversations like we're having now. So the COP is a hook to talk to decision makers and emphasize key principles around our climate commitments, our just transition, and climate justice. So we can use the COP as a moment to build power for system change and to put pressure on governments and businesses, and to bring these climate justice demands to the fore. I'll insert a break under that. So how can we, I'm moving on to the next question, how can we get involved in the Irish climate movement? I might just start this answer with a quote from, I'm not sure whether it's from Professor Catherine Hale or Bill McKippen, but it's that screwing in a new system is more important than screwing in a light bulb. In other words, this is not about decision makers putting responsibility on individuals for climate action. This is an opportunity for individuals to place demands on decision makers collectively. So it's an opportunity, I guess, to organize, to come together be that as family, friends, in work, in your residence committee, in communities, in villages or towns, and raise the most important climate action issues that are relevant for your local area. So we need collective action and activism to demand the right changes from government. How do I talk to my local decision makers, you might ask? Friends of the Earth, alongside the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, launched our One Future campaign last year, and as part of this, we facilitated the establishment of One Future groups in constituencies across the country. And these groups, they're not coordinated by Friends of the Earth. We facilitate them, but they're designed to be self-sustaining and led by local people, so they can directly engage their local politicians on the climate action that they see as most important, be it in agriculture, transport, energy, in our homes, or on protecting biodiversity. So I'd urge people to visit and sign up at onefuture.ie. And these local campaigning groups may well have meetings with decision makers in and around the 6th of November. And more further information will be on our website or Twitter feed. The details are still to be ironed out. And there's also plans for a joint march for climate justice on the 6th of November in cities all over the world, including Dublin. Friends of the Earth isn't leading the coordination of this ourselves, but us and several other groups will be marching on the 6th. There's also, I'm just coming to the end now and reading off a list. There's also an opportunity to participate in an online People Summit, which is sort of a global counter summit to the COP, and that's going between the 7th and the 10th. There's more information on the People Summit on the FO Scotland website and on the COP26 Coalition website. I'll pass on some of these links. And Friends of the Earth is obviously gathering and mobilizing. So Friends of the Earth organizations from across the world from the 5th to the 8th of November. And I know that other groups like the Jesuit Centre, An Taisce, Stop Climate Chaos, Trócaire will be attending the COP. So I'd also suggest, you follow them on Twitter or sign up to their newsletters to get the latest information. And lastly, on our website, we also have a map of grassroots environmental groups in areas all over the country, which you can click on and follow or contact. There may be other petitions related to other relevant bits and pieces of legislation over the next month. And again, you'll find that all on the Friends of the Earth website. And as I said, I'm going to post some links and resources in the chat box. And I'll stop there.
Jerry, thanks very much. That was an amazing kind of tour de force presentation for a whole bunch of different angles on COP. I think Ciara is back here. Ciara, are you there?
I am. Sorry, we had some. So first, thank you very much, Jerry, for the amazing presentation. We had some technical issues in the background, so I had to. So Kevin jumped in, and I'll just remove pin there. So we have. So yeah, thanks a million. That was an amazing presentation in terms of everything that and all you need to know for the upcoming COP. And we have a couple of questions now. So I hold on just 1 second, and I'll just go through the question and answers. So there's a couple of questions here. So we have Sean, thank you very much. Or let me see. So from Keith Adams. So Jerry, thank you for your presentation. Some economists suggest that a 4-degree of Celsius temperature rise is the economically most beneficial pathway for all of our efforts for justice. Are you worried that these more money-minded positions would win out?
Yeah, so is it 4 degrees? Economists have argued that 4 degrees would be the most beneficial. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, I think it was the economist
Nordhaus.
Yeah, Nordhaus.
All right. Okay.
Nobel Prize winning economist.
Oh, right. Yes. Yes, we don't agree with that, to say the least. I think I won't get into Nordhaus, but it is completely clear that, as you may have seen IPCC reports, that these International Panel on Climate Change, these scientific reports, which have highlighted just how completely devastating temperature increases over 1.5 degrees would be. We're even seeing the effects now this summer in terms of severe weather, both all over the world. And like in terms of economic impacts, I would fundamentally disagree of any of that being in any way beneficial. And I think what's more to the point, and this you often see this discussion in climate debates in Ireland, is that that climate action is essentially too costly, that it simply involves increasing carbon tax and demanding that people put their money in their own pocket, and every new measure is simply an additional cost. Whereas what scientists and academics have consistently shown is that what's most costly is the climate emergency, is ongoing inaction, be that through severe weather or health impacts, social impacts. So I think that is more or less underlining, if you're going to take an economic perspective, the economic argument is for governments to implement and lead activities, or not activities, to lead investment and new policies and new measures across all sectors as early as possible.
Thanks a million, Jerry. It's a fair point. I think economists have a different idea of what's ecologically possible and what happens ecologically, rather than just in terms of what they deem economically possible. So we've had some issues with Sean. He's just dropped off the webinar at the minute, so I'll just direct a couple more questions to you, Jerry, if that's okay.
That's
while
okay.
We try and get Sean back online. So there's a couple more questions here. So when an average Irish person has a carbon footprint of 13.2 tons, and the average citizen of Benin has a footprint of 0.6 tons, can we really say that population is a problem? So every newborn person in Ireland weighs 22 times their Beninese counterpart. Surely this general call to consider population is another way for the West to disguise their complicity and power.
On the population issue, I mean, it's even an issue. I would let Father Sean come back in, because I think he did originally raise that himself. But I think, look, it is important that we're not only focusing in on population and linking population discussions to climate, because ultimately Ireland's carbon footprint is significantly worse than developing countries. But I think if we really want to talk about increasing in population, what that is really linked into, and a way of having a more productive discussion, is how are developing countries being supported to develop sustainably. And this is very much linked in with the Sustainable Development Goals. And you'll be glad to hear, I won't give a presentation on the Sustainable Development Goals, but climate action is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. But there are also goals on health, on food, on energy, on infrastructure. And these are an interlinked mix of targets which states have also signed up to, which address not only environmental issues, but also economic and social ones. And states need to be integrating. What does integrating mean? They need to be actively putting these goals, and there's a whole rake of sub-targets and indicators that sits underneath them. They need to be putting that into their policies and linking it to their investments. And this is to finish and to answer the question, they need to be supporting developing countries to meet these Sustainable Development Goals. I hope that's partly answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's actually you've pretty much hit the nail on the head in terms of I'm not sure if you've read all of Laudato Si, but integral ecology and thinking holistically is the main focal point of it, and that captured it.
Laudato Si is a great point to bring in.
Yeah, so it being able to weave all of the different threads together of social justice and biodiversity and climate change and the causes and the solutions, they're all thinking about it and how they interconnect. It's the only way to look at it. So yeah, thank you very much. So I'll just so I think Sean is still having some issues getting back in. So Jerry, I'm sorry, you're under the spotlight.
You're all right. You're all right.
Okay, so is there any hope? So just this one's from Patrick. So is there any hope of removing climate action from the governments as a base for launching a case for the ISDS system?
So that's the investor state dispute settlement mechanism. So I'm just going to read that question again. Is there any hope of removing climate action from governments as a base for launching a case in the ISDS system? Patrick, it may just be I didn't have enough coffee today, but I'm, in terms of understanding the link between the two there, but I am aware that, you know, a major risk is that in order for states to take greater climate action, and particularly on fossil fuels, but it's relevant to other areas as well, involves, you know, it involves keeping fossil fuels in the ground. And where, for example, there is a contract or agreement with a fossil fuel company, essentially that I'm not doing a good job of explaining this, but that company can potentially take country to court for, you know, their loss of revenue, because they can no longer extract that fossil fuel, and they can do it through an investor state dispute settlement procedure. And it's the risk here is these types of systems being present in international agreements like the Energy Charter Treaty, and several Friends of the Earth and other organizations have called on countries to actually essentially opt out and bring to an end, I'm simplifying, the Energy Charter Treaty exactly because of this ISDS system. Patrick, I hope that's partly answered your question.
Now this so this question is actually from me. So I'll be going to the COP for the first time this year, and I would love to know even just what the day-to-day what you do day to day, like how when you get to COP, what does your everyday look like, I suppose? Like what do you do there in terms of how do you work, I suppose?
The short answer to that question is it's a bit of a circus, but the longer answer is, of course, it's great that you'll be there, Ciara, and it's an absolute privilege. I worked previously for Trócaire and attended a lot of the pre-negotiating sessions and the negotiations that led to the Paris Agreement. So that's a few years ago now, back in 2015. And you have, just to explain to people, you have a series of meeting rooms for government representatives to meet and negotiate on various technical aspects of climate action related to the Paris Agreement. This is what I discussed previously. And you also have spaces for people to mobilize, for people to for non-state actors to come together. And there's also a space for what's called side events. So these are any and all types of talks, lectures, conferences, seminars on every single type of climate issue under the sun. And they're not all hugely technical. They're extremely accessible, and they're running all the time at the same time as the COP. And I should have said at the start, this is over 2 weeks, the COP, and you have at a certain date, I think it might be around the 6th or 7th, but Ciara, you might know more than me. You have a ministerial section, so where a high level session where ministers from around the world would come together and sign off on particular aspects of the negotiations or where they've gotten to so far. And there's also a space for them to provide presentations in the form of to provide updates in the form of a plenary. So I've sort of explained the context. In terms of what you actually do, I guess really ideally it's about trying to meet the relevant officials and the relevant politicians to highlight some of the messages that Sean and others have talked about. It's an opportunity for people to mobilize, like, not only civil society organizations, but also, youth groups and community groups and individuals to come together. And it's also an opportunity, I guess, to learn, be that in the form of side events or otherwise. And there are also at the same time, like civil society organizations like Friends of the Earth or like Climate Action Network would be coming together in parallel meeting rooms to update each other and give each other all the latest intel on what is actually happening in negotiations and on what needs to happen. And lastly, it's an opportunity to talk to media. So there's media from all around the world there. And as I mentioned previously, I guess it's an opportunity to highlight some of the core climate justice messages and to put that on the radar of the media as well. So there's no really sort of set from the point of view of a civil society representative. There's no sort of set time schedule, or it's up to your good self and your organization and others there as to what, how, when, and where you want to do. But there's an awful lot going on all at the same time. Oh, I think you're. Yeah.
I am, yeah. Sorry. Thanks a million. Yeah, that's extremely informative for me, because I'm looking forward to going, but I'm aware that it will be a circus. So we actually have Sean is back with us for the last couple of minutes under a synonym of me. So if we Sean, can you hear us? Okay, we'll see if he's able to come back in. But first, thank you very much, Jerry. That was extremely informative, and you've had to answer a lot of questions there. So I'll just go through another question at the bottom just to see, try to get as many as possible. So there is a couple of questions about the difference between net zero and just zero emissions. So Jerry, I'll put this one to you as well. So why do they aim for net zero by 2050 and not just zero emissions?
That's a great question. So net zero is essentially, or what's also called climate neutrality, is that obviously states need to be reducing their emissions to zero as soon as possible. But there's this, it's a recognition that it will be very difficult for states to reduce emissions to absolute zero. So it may be possible, even though in some very limited way, and I'm going to come back to this, there may be still some emissions continuing in a very limited fashion. These can be mitigated through, and here is where we get into the nub of the issue. It could be increased afforestation, pulling carbon from the air, or it could be through new and wonderful but completely unproven technologies like carbon capture and storage. And this is really the whole net idea. I sort of have two parts to this. Like, fundamentally, relying on the net part of that sentence is hugely dangerous, because it leads to this sort of idea that sure, won't there be some form of emissions in the future? Well, we can continue in some way, shape, or form with the status quo, and technology will save us in the end. It's a danger essentially of a kick to touch. So the core message needs to be that emissions have to be reduced to zero as quickly as possible, and that we shouldn't be waiting for 2050 for a net zero. We should be trying to reach that as soon as possible, in order to do our fair share and in order to be in line with the Paris Agreement, or excuse me, the climate science, I should say. Having said that, I think I would argue, others might argue with me, that having a hard target of net zero in legislation, and it's in Ireland's New Climate Act, is helpful, because it is a very useful means of holding the Irish government to account, and to make sure that they are putting in place the right types of policies and measures and investments to align with that target. And for several years, Ireland has done nothing of the sort. So I would say it's a useful tool from a legislative perspective, but it's not the complete answer. And there are several experts and scientists and academics around the world who have major concerns for all sorts of reasons with net zero, and for good reason. But there are, as I said, from a legislative perspective, it does offer, it's a useful hook, but it's a hook that needs to be improved upon.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I think we've kind of run out of time, and I let everyone go have their final have a cup of tea after a long session. So I think, thank you very much, Jerry. And I think Sean is just back. So Sean, thank you very much. I'm so sorry that you were locked out for the guts of half an hour. Thank you for joining us.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, yes.
I actually worked on my phone, yeah.
Oh, perfect. So I'll go over just for 2 or 3 minutes. Sean, I'll just ask you one question, just because there was a good few questions for you, and I'll just go over for 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Fine.
So I think, let me see now. So John was like, thank you, Father Sean. Can I ask you what policy solutions you'd recommend for farmers to shift away from dairy and towards ecologically sound farming? So I know you touched on farming in your presentation. I'm just wondering, do you have any ideas of how to shift away from that?
I do. Fundamentally, as we're talking about 10 billion people living on a planet, we're going to have different ways of feeding ourselves, and animal will be very, very slight, and also the dairy world. So we in Ireland, we say we're feeding the world with dairy and with milk. But what about our vegetables here? We import a huge amount of them. So I really believe that Teagasc has a serious business ahead in the future, because what is happening is not just happening in terms of climate change. When I was growing up, there was 500 rivers and lakes in excellent condition in Ireland. Last year, according to the EPA, there are 20. We just can't have that into the future. But these people need serious money, because I come from I'm down here in the country at the moment. I see the kind of money they put into these extraordinary buildings, and also the technologies, and they will need serious help from both Teagasc and also from the government. Yeah.
Okay.
And
so
it's going to have to be, because in Ireland, we're supposed to reduce our greenhouse gases by 50% by 2030. That's 9 years. How are we going to do that if 34% of our greenhouse gases comes from methane?
Okay, so thank you very much, Sean, and thanks a million again for your presentations. And
what I would like to say, I would like to see, like, this must be like, this is the Jesuit your website. We have to be very serious that we as Catholics have been absolutely hopeless on these two issues. if you look at the teachings of the social teachings of the church book that came out in 2004, you know, there are 16 pages on the environment as against 27 pages on human work. Well, that doesn't line up. And by the way, on both of these issues, the two most important issues facing our planet, there's one paragraph on climate change and one paragraph on biodiversity. We should be ashamed of ourselves that we haven't taken this anywhere as seriously as we should. And partly because of Augustine. If we had taken St. Columban more seriously, when he said, if you want to know God, learn about creation. And if we'd moved away from Augustine much more quickly, we would be recognizing that these all are other creatures with us living in this planet, and they have a place like everyone else.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'll thank you, Sean, and thank you, Jerry. And I just seen this one comment from Mary Flood. So thank you, everyone. Very interesting, but very scary too. And I think this webinar, it is about the hard, scary facts, but from it, we should also know that there are solutions in here. So COP is the COP summit in Glasgow and the COP, the biodiversity COP15 summit as well. They are going towards solutions. So it's not without hope. And I want everyone to leave thinking that this isn't, it's a bad situation, but it isn't hopeless. So I think hopefully from that you get it. And I've seen that Jerry also highlighted that it's not just Friends of the Earth or Stop Climate Chaos that have information on this. There's lots of information around on Taishka and Christian Aid and Oxfam all have loads of information on this. So I'll just repeat again. So thank you very much to everyone for attending.
And actually,
oh sorry,
and Laudato Si is the best document ever produced by the Catholic Church on both climate change and biodiversity, for a very simple reason. They use science. One of the first times they ever have used science to talk about what's happening. Yeah,
I completely concur, Sean. It's one of the main, I suppose, Catholic documents that I've read all the way through, and I've gone back. It is an extremely good document, and there's so much to learn from it. So so yeah, thank you very much to all the attendees for attending, and specifically thank you very much to Jerry and Sean. And I'll go on have a lovely afternoon or evening, not afternoon, well past that. Okay. So thank you very much. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.